6:18 a.m. Western Pacific International Airspace. The U.S. jet was not alone, but it was isolated. Flying at high altitude over the Pacific, the aircraft maintained a steady course along a legally recognized international corridor. Its mission was neither secret nor provocative. Sensors were active, data was flowing, and every movement was logged, recorded, and transmitted back to command nodes thousands of miles away. This was routine until it wasn't. 6:21 a.m. First sensor anomaly. Inside the cockpit, the pilot noticed the change before the warning systems fully reacted. The helmet-mounted display flickered, not with alarms, but with new data. A faint return appeared on the edge of the sensor fusion map. Then another. Fast, high, closing. The aircraft's systems cross-referenced radar, infrared, and electronic signatures in milliseconds. The result locked in. 2 unknown contacts. Stealth profile consistent with Chinese fighters. The pilot's jaw tightened. 6:23 a.m. Identification confirmed. The contact sharpened as distance closed. 2 Chinese fighter jets, operating in a coordinated formation, were approaching on an intercept vector. Not a patrol, not a coincidence. This was intentional. 6:25 a.m. Command alerted. At U.S. Pacific Command, analysts leaned closer to their screens. Chinese fighters closing on U.S. aircraft. Vector suggests intercept. The response was calm, measured. Maintain course. Observe. Do not escalate. This wasn't the first time Chinese aircraft had approached U.S. jets, but something about the geometry felt different. 6:27 a.m. Visual contact. The first Chinese fighter slid into view, close enough for the U.S. pilot to see markings clearly. Too close. The second fighter positioned itself slightly above and behind, offset just enough to cover firing angles. This wasn't shadowing, it was boxing. 6:29 a.m. Unsafe maneuvers begin. Without warning, the lead Chinese fighter surged forward, crossing directly in front of the U.S. jet at minimal separation. The wake turbulence jolted the aircraft, forcing the pilot to counter instinctively. Alarms chirped, not critical, but loud enough to register. 6:30 a.m. First radio call. The U.S. pilot transmitted calmly. Chinese military aircraft. This is a United States military aircraft operating in international airspace. Maintain safe separation. No response. The Chinese fighters remained silent. Deliberately. 6:32 a.m. Electronic pressure detected. The U.S. jet systems picked up emissions. Low power. Focused. Chinese radar. Not searching, tracking. The cockpit tone changed. Subtle. Insistent. 6:33 a.m. Command reassessment. Back at command, the assessment shifted. They're not just intercepting, they're testing response thresholds. Still, the directive held. Do not provoke. 6:35 a.m. The second pass. The Chinese lead fighter executed another aggressive maneuver, this time rolling inverted and slicing past the U.S. jet's nose. The distance was measured in meters. One miscalculation would have ended both aircraft. 6:36 a.m. Weapon systems change state. Inside the U.S. cockpit, the pilot noticed the shift immediately. Chinese weapon systems transitioned. Not fired, not locked, but armed. That distinction mattered. 6:38 a.m. The moment everything changed. The Chinese fighter pulled slightly ahead, nose dipping. Then, a flash, a streak, the unmistakable burst of cannon fire. Tracer rounds tore through empty air ahead of the U.S. jet's flight path. They didn't hit, they weren't meant to, but they were real. 6:38:30 a.m. Direct attack confirmed. The cockpit erupted in alerts. Gunfire proximity warnings, threat indicators flashing amber. The U.S. pilot's heart rate spiked, but his hands remained steady. Chinese aircraft fired live rounds. 6:39 a.m. Command shock. At Pacific Command, the room went silent. Weapons discharge confirmed. No ambiguity, no misinterpretation. A foreign fighter had fired on a U.S. aircraft. 6:40 a.m. Rules of engagement shift. The legal line had been crossed. Escalation protocols authorized. Defensive maneuvers approved. But one directive remained unchanged. No first shot. 6:41 a.m. Chinese fighters press in. Instead of disengaging, the Chinese fighters tightened formation. The second jet dropped lower, aligning itself behind the U.S. aircraft's vulnerable quadrant. This was no warning anymore. This was pressure. 6:43 a.m. U.S. jet holds course. Against every instinct, the U.S. pilot did not turn away. Braking now would signal retreat, and retreat could invite pursuit. He held speed, held altitude, held discipline. 6:45 a.m. Allied sensors activate. The engagement was no longer isolated. Japanese and Allied radar systems picked it up. Naval assets adjusted sensors upward. What had begun as a 3-aircraft encounter was now being watched by multiple nations. 6:47 a.m. New contacts detected. On the U.S. jet's display, 2 new symbols appeared. Fast, high, closing from the east. Friendly fighters, scrambled minutes earlier. 6:49 a.m. Chinese command decision point. Inside a PLA Air Force Command Center, officers watched carefully. The message had been sent. The response was forming, but pushing further carried risk. Still, maintain pressure. 6:51 a.m. The sky tightens. 4 fighters now converged on a shrinking pocket of airspace. 2 Chinese jets, 1 U.S. jet under direct threat, 2 Allied fighters racing in. No margin, no room for error. 6:53 a.m. Radar illumination spike. Inside the U.S. cockpit, a tone sounded. Sharp, unmistakable. Fire control radar. Not passive, not ambiguous. A lock. The Chinese fighter had escalated again. 6:54 a.m. The U.S. pilot saw it at the same time his systems did. Missile bay doors opening, just slightly. A signal, a threat, a question. He whispered to himself, "They're daring us." And as Allied fighters broke into visual range, the sky hovered on the edge of something irreversible. A Chinese fighter launched a direct attack on a U.S. jet. The rounds missed, but the message did not. And as more aircraft closed in, the question was no longer if this would escalate, but how far. 6:55 a.m. Western Pacific. The airspace tightens. The sky had become crowded with intent. As the 2 Allied fighters entered visual range, their presence immediately changed the geometry of the confrontation. The Chinese pilots saw them too. New heat signatures, new radar returns, new variables that could no longer be controlled as easily. What had been a 2-on-1 pressure tactic was now a 4-on-2 standoff, and the margin for error vanished. 6:56 a.m. Tactical shift. The U.S. jet under threat altered course slightly, just enough to realign its defensive posture without appearing aggressive. The maneuver was subtle, deliberate, and designed to buy seconds. Seconds mattered now. Behind him, 1 Allied fighter slid into a protective position, offset to guard the most vulnerable angle. The second ally climbed higher, scanning for missile cues. The Chinese formation hesitated. That hesitation was visible. 6:58 a.m. Command channels open. At U.S. Pacific Command, escalation protocols moved to the next tier. Weapons free for defensive action if locked. Do not fire unless fired upon again. Every word was weighed, every decision documented. No one wanted history to record who crossed the final line. 6:59 a.m. Chinese fighters reposition. Instead of backing away, the Chinese lead fighter climbed sharply, cutting across the airspace above the U.S. formation. The maneuver forced the Allied aircraft to adjust, creating momentary separation. That was the opening. The second Chinese fighter dropped low and accelerated. 7 a.m. Missile warning tone. Inside the U.S. cockpit, the warning sounded shrill, unmistakable. Missile guidance radar. Not a full lock, but close. Close enough to force reaction. Countermeasures primed automatically. The pilot's breathing slowed. Training took over. 7:01 a.m. Defensive maneuvers executed. The U.S. jet broke left and descended slightly, deploying electronic countermeasures in a controlled burst. The Allied fighters mirrored the move, spreading the formation and complicating targeting solutions. This was no longer a warning dance. This was combat geometry. 7:03 a.m. Chinese command reassessment. Inside a PLA Air Force Operations Center, officers spoke rapidly but quietly. The original objective, send a message, had been delivered, but the situation was evolving faster than expected. Multiple Allied assets were now watching. Satellites, ships, regional air bases. The cost of escalation was rising by the second. 7:05 a.m. The second shot that never came. The Chinese fighter that had fired earlier held its position briefly. Missile bay doors opened wider. Then they closed. A decision had been made, but not yet. 7:07 a.m. Allied reinforcements detected. Far beyond visual range, radar systems detected additional aircraft lifting from Allied bases. They were still minutes away, but their launch alone shifted the balance. The Pacific was waking up. 7:09 a.m. High-level communications initiated. Secure lines lit up. Not pilots to pilots, but capitals to capitals. Military hotlines activated. Diplomats alerted. This encounter had escalated beyond the cockpit. 7:11 a.m. De-escalation signal sent. Without a word, the Chinese lead fighter rolled away from the formation. pulling altitude and widening separation. The second fighter followed seconds later, maintaining sensors but reducing pressure. It wasn't retreat, but it wasn't attack, it was a pause. 7:13 a.m. U.S. aircraft hold position. The U.S. pilots did not pursue. They didn't celebrate. They simply held. Holding now was power. 7:15 a.m. The standoff ends. The Chinese fighters turned back toward their airspace, gradually fading from sensors. The Allied aircraft remained on station until the threat was fully gone. No missiles fired, no aircraft lost, but nothing about the encounter felt like a victory. 7:20 a.m. Aftermath begins. As the skies cleared, analysts began reconstructing every second of the incident. Gunfire confirmed, radar locks verified, rules of engagement reviewed. This would not stay quiet. Later that day, strategic consequences. Within hours, intelligence agencies around the world had a shared understanding. A Chinese fighter had fired live rounds at a U.S. aircraft in international airspace. That fact alone altered calculations. Exercises were postponed, others accelerated, naval patrols expanded, air patrols doubled. What had happened in minutes would echo for months. Military analysis. Experts would later agree on one thing. This was not an accident. It was a test of restraint, a test of reaction time, a test of how close the world could come to open conflict without crossing it. The bigger picture. No official statements mentioned gunfire. Public language remained vague, but behind closed doors, doctrines shifted. Future intercepts would not be treated as routine, and every pilot flying those corridors knew the truth. The rules had changed. The Chinese fighter had launched a direct attack. The U.S. jet had survived, but the real impact was invisible, written into planning documents, briefing rooms, and the minds of those who would fly the next mission. Because the next encounter might not end with restraint. The shots missed, the missiles stayed silent, but the warning was delivered, and the skies over the Pacific would never feel the same again.